The town of Salvation didn't execute Silas Vance. That would have cost the county the price of a rope. Instead, they simply told a 13-year-old boy to go die somewhere else. It was the spring of 1886 in the Montana Territory, a place where mercy was as scarce as a warm breeze in January. To the God-fearing folks of the valley, Silas was nothing more than a stain on their pristine boardwalks. Born without a voice, he was viewed with deep suspicion, a defect in a community that believed a boy who couldn't pray aloud was a boy without a soul. He was a ghost in the periphery, silent as the grave, moving through the dusty streets like a bad omen. But silence doesn't stop hunger, and hunger was the orphan's constant companion. On a Tuesday afternoon, Silas stood outside Sterling's Emporium, the grandest building in the valley, his stomach twisted into a knotted fist. By the back door sat a barrel of bruised apples, fermenting in the sun, destined for the hogs. They were brown, soft, and smelled of vinegar, but to a starving boy, they smelled like survival. He didn't sneak and he didn't run. He simply reached out a dirt-caked hand and took one rotting apple. "Thief!" The shout cracked like a bullwhip. Montgomery Sterling, the town's founder and wealthiest merchant, stepped onto the boardwalk. He didn't see a hungry child. He saw a rat gnawing at his profits. Sterling snatched the apple from Silas's hand, crushing the soft pulp between his fingers before wiping the mess on his coat. "Filth!" he spat. "Just like your rock-crazy parents, taking what isn't yours." Silas opened his mouth, his throat working convulsively, but no sound came out. Desperate, he raised his hands, signing frantically, pointing to the pigs, then to his hollow stomach. "Stop that twitching," Sterling snapped. "You look like a rabid animal." The trial that followed 10 minutes later in the mayor's office was less a judicial proceeding and more a disposal of unwanted refuse. Mayor Abernathy, a man with a spine as soft as tallow, wouldn't even look the boy in the eye. He mumbled something about property being property, but Sterling cut him off with the booming authority of a man who owned the banknotes on half the town. "He contributes nothing. He speaks nothing. And now he steals," Sterling declared. "We cannot have vagrancy in a town named for the Lord's grace." Sterling walked to the large map on the wall, tracing the jagged line of the mountains with a cruel smile. His parents filed a foolish claim on the north slope of Shadow Mountain before the mine collapsed on them, he said. "Let him have it. It's rock and ice. Useless land for a useless boy." The decree was absolute. Silas was to take his parents' old horse, their tools, and be gone by sundown. If he was seen within the town limits again, he would be shot as a trespasser. The walk out of Salvation was a gauntlet of shame. The townspeople lined the boardwalks, their faces hard masks of indifference, watching the small figure lead a gray mare named Misty toward the imposing silhouette of the mountain. The horse was laden with scavenged tools and a roll of geological maps, the only inheritance Silas had. "Look at him," a man jeered from the saloon porch, off to dig his own grave. "Go on, Silas," another shouted. "Tell us how you'll get rich on granite." Silas didn't look back. He couldn't scream at their cruelty or curse their hypocrisy. Instead, he straightened his small back, setting his jaw in a line of granite hard enough to break a pickaxe. As he crossed the boundary of the town, leaving the warmth of the valley for the freezing shadow of the peaks, the silence of the mountains rose up to meet him. They thought they had sentenced him to death. But as Silas gripped the reins and looked up at the unforgiving wild, he didn't feel fear. Away from the noise of their ridicule, he felt the ground vibrate beneath his feet. He felt the mountain waiting. The north slope of Shadow Mountain was a graveyard of ambition. It was a place where the wind didn't just blow, it scoured. It stripped the bark from the ancient, twisted junipers and flayed the hope from any man foolish enough to stake a claim there. But Silas Vance didn't have hope. He had something far more durable: necessity. For the first 3 weeks, the boy and the horse were ghosts in a white wilderness. Silas slept, huddled against Misty's flank under a makeshift lean-to of pine boughs, shivering so violently his teeth rattled a rhythm against the silence. Below him, the town of Salvation shimmered like a mirage in the green valley, the smoke rising from their chimneys, lazy, comfortable smoke. It was a taunt. But Silas turned his back on the valley. He had his father's map, a crumbling parchment stained with coffee and coal dust, marked with the frantic scribbles of a man who saw value where others saw only rock. There was a specific coordinate, a jagged fissure near the tree line marked with a heavy charcoal X. When Silas finally found it, hidden behind a curtain of scrub brush, it didn't look like salvation. It looked like a wound in the earth, a narrow, dark throat of a cave that smelled faintly of rotten eggs. To anyone else, it was a foul stench. To Silas, it was the sweetest perfume on earth. It was the smell of sulfur, the underworld's boiler room. He crawled inside. 10 feet back, the biting wind died. 20 feet back, the air grew heavy and humid. He pressed his palms against the rough stone floor and felt it. A steady, radiating heat that seeped through his calloused skin and settled into his bones. His father had been right. The mountain was breathing. The work began then, and it was brutal. It was back-breaking labor that would have broken a grown man, let alone a malnourished 13-year-old. But Silas possessed a relentless focus that the speaking world could not understand. Without the distraction of words or idle chatter, all his energy was funneled into action. He became a creature of the earth. He used his pickaxe not with brute force, but with a surgical precision his father had taught him before the accident. Listen to the rock. It will tell you where it wants to break. Day after day, Silas expanded the fissure. He hauled sleds of debris out, his small muscles hardening into cords of steel. Misty, his gray mare, was his silent partner, dragging the heavy loads without complaint. They worked in a rhythm of shared survival. When the sun dipped low, painting the sky in bruises of purple and orange, Silas would stop to timber the ceiling. He used scavenged logs, fitting them together with intricate notches, creating a support system that was robust and unyielding. The town called him a fool, but up here on the granite slopes, he was becoming an engineer. His greatest enemy wasn't the cold anymore. It was the darkness. The cave, warm as it was a tomb of blackness. He couldn't burn firewood for light. The smoke would choke him in the enclosed space. He needed a solution that didn't require combustion. He remembered the mica. On the western ridge, there was a vein of the mineral, sheets of silicate that peeled away like transparent paper. Silas spent days harvesting it, his fingers bleeding from the sharp edges. He polished the sheets with ash and water until they gleamed like silver. He didn't just stick them on the walls. He calculated the angles. He built a shaft near the entrance, a periscope of stone and earth lined with the mica. The first time it worked, it felt like a miracle. The morning sun hit the entrance reflector, bounced down the shaft, and exploded into the main cavern. The light wasn't harsh. It was a diffused, ethereal glow that bathed his underground home in a soft, pearlescent twilight. It turned the gray rock into a shimmering cathedral. He called it home. The hunters from town, passing on the ridge above, called it the Gopher Hole. One afternoon, a group of trappers stopped near the entrance, looking down at the boy covered in muck, wrestling a boulder. "Still digging your way to China, boy?" one of them shouted, spitting tobacco juice onto the snow near Silas's boots. "Sterling says you've gone feral. Says we ought to put you down before you start biting." Silas didn't look up. He didn't pause. He simply leveraged the pry bar, his face a mask of stoic indifference, and rolled the rock onto the sled. "Crazy as a loon," the trapper muttered, turning his horse away. "Let the winter take him. It's coming fast." They were right about the winter, but they were wrong about the boy. Inside the cavern, Silas had created a biosphere. He found the source of the heat, a thermal spring bubbling up from a deep fracture. He carved channels into the floor, diverting the steaming water to run along the perimeter of the room before draining back into the earth. It was a radiant heating system that kept the ambient temperature at a balmy 55 degrees, regardless of the blizzard raging outside. In the center of the room, he built terraced garden beds. He mixed the volcanic soil with bat guano he'd scraped from the upper crevices. He planted the withered potatoes he'd saved, the carrot tops, and the hardy kale seeds his mother had stitched into the lining of his coat. In the dim, humid light of the mica mirrors, life began to stir. Green shoots pushed through the black soil, tenacious and defiant. It wasn't just a shelter anymore. It was an ecosystem. He partitioned a stall for Misty near the entrance for ventilation, her body heat adding to the warmth. He built a smoker for the trout he caught in the non-freezing streams lower down the mountain. By late autumn, the transformation was complete. The Gopher Hole was gone. In its place was a subterranean fortress. Silas sat on a rug of woven goat hair, watching the steam rise from his thermal creek. He was clean, he was warm. His belly was full of smoked fish and roasted tubers. He raised his hands in the quiet light, looking at the calluses that mapped his palms. He hadn't spoken a word in 13 years. But looking around at the stone walls that held back the wind, at the green garden thriving in the dark, at the loyal horse chewing contentedly in the corner, Silas realized he had said plenty. He had built a monument to his own existence. By the time the first frost of 1887 hardened the mud in the valley streets, Silas Vance had ceased to be a boy in the eyes of the mountain. He had become its tenant, its student, and its master. Down in Salvation, the townspeople sat in their drafty parlors, speculating on when the mute brat would freeze solid. They imagined him shivering in a hole, gnawing on tree bark to stave off the end. They couldn't have been more wrong. The Gopher Hole was no longer a burrow. It was a feat of high-altitude engineering that rivaled anything the Ivy League architects back east could dream up. Silas understood the cruel calculus of the cave. Heat was life, but smoke was death. He couldn't simply light a fire against the back wall without suffocating himself. So he improvised. He constructed a ventilation system that was a marvel of primitive physics. Using hollowed-out logs and slate he chiseled from the cliff face, he built a U-bend chimney near the entrance. It was a simple gravity trap designed to allow the stale, carbon-heavy air to escape while preventing the screaming wind from blowing back into the cavern. With the air quality secured, he turned his attention to sustenance. He didn't just want to survive the winter, he intended to outlast it. He built a smoker from river stones near the thermal vent, using the natural heat and green juniper boughs to cure the trout he pulled from the lower streams. The cavern didn't smell of damp despair or wet dog. It smelled of wood smoke, roasted tubers, and crushed mint. While Silas was calibrating his sanctuary with the precision of a watchmaker, Montgomery Sterling was busy erecting his own monument to survival, or so he thought. In the center of town, the Fortress of Commerce rose 3 stories high, casting a long, arrogant shadow over the main street. It was a massive storehouse designed to hold enough grain to feed the valley for 2 years, a visible symbol of Sterling's dominance over the land. But it was a testament to Sterling's vanity, built fast and cheap with green, uncured timber. Sterling walked the perimeter of his creation, tapping the damp logs with his cane, deaf to the warning sounds of wood that hadn't been allowed to settle. He saw a bank vault for wheat. The laws of physics saw a ticking time bomb. The contrast between the 2 builders was stark. One built with silence and stone, respecting the laws of nature. The other built with noise and arrogance, defying them. The seasons turned, grinding forward with the relentless indifference of the frontier. The summer of 1888 was blisteringly hot, baking the valley floor until the dust rose in choking clouds. But up in the mute's palace, the temperature held at a steady, miraculous 55 degrees. Misty, the gray mare, grew fat on dried mountain grass and carrots harvested from the subterranean garden. She was no longer the rib-thin nag that had limped out of town under a hail of insults. She was sleek, her coat glossy, a mythological beast guarding the entrance to the underworld. Silas spent his evenings on a rug of woven goat hair, reading his father's geology books by the soft, diffused light of his mica mirrors. He traced the diagrams of fault lines and aquifers, his mind expanding in the quiet. He learned to read the mountain like a text, understanding the stress points, the water tables, the thermal veins. He realized that the town below was built on a floodplain of ignorance, while he was anchored in the bedrock of truth. He was the king of a buried kingdom, and for the first time in his life, his silence didn't feel like a curse. It felt like peace. But nature, like a coiled rattlesnake, never sleeps for long. Then came October. The shift wasn't gradual, it was a violent slam of the door. On the morning of October 29th, the birds stopped singing. The wind, which usually howled through the passes, fell into a heavy, ominous stillness. The pressure in the air dropped so rapidly that Silas's ears popped, a physical warning that something massive was shifting in the atmosphere. He stood at the entrance of his fortress, watching the sky turn a color that shouldn't exist in nature, a bruised, angry purple that looked like a fist coming down. The ghost storm was knocking. Down in Salvation, the town was celebrating the harvest, drunk on whiskey and hubris. They toasted to their full barns and their warm hearths, oblivious to the barometer bottoming out. They trusted in Sterling's green timber and their own self-righteousness. But Silas didn't toast. He worked. He double-checked the seals on his mica shafts. He brought in the last of the drying fish. He led Misty to the back of the cavern, near the thermal spring, and filled her trough. He prepared his world for the violence to come, silent and steady, while the valley below partied on the edge of oblivion. When the storm hit, it didn't arrive with the polite warning of flurries or the gentle drift of a winter postcard. It hit the valley like a hammer blow from the Almighty. The temperature plummeted 50 degrees in less than an hour. It went from a crisp autumn afternoon to a flash-frozen hellscape of 20 below zero. The sky simply vanished, swallowed by a wall of white moving at 60 miles an hour. In the town of Salvation, the grand houses built with Thomas Brennan's civilized pine planks were wholly unsuited for this savage assault. The wind tore shingles from roofs like they were playing cards. Glass windows, the pride of the wealthy and the envy of the poor, shattered under the pressure, letting the blizzard scream into parlors and bedrooms. Fires were blown out down the chimneys, filling homes with choking ash and freezing drafts. But the true horror, the one that would doom them all, was happening in the dark belly of Sterling's warehouse. As the temperature bottomed out, the physics of the frontier took over. The uncured wood of the warehouse walls, green and full of sap, shrank and warped violently in the extreme cold. Massive cracks opened up between the logs. The fine, powder-dry snow, driven by hurricane-force winds, hissed through the gaps like pressurized steam. Inside the dark warehouse, the moisture met the latent heat of the grain piles. It was a catastrophic chemistry. The dampness woke up a dormant weevil infestation that had been ignored in the haste of the harvest. The town's food supply began to ferment and rot, turning into a poisonous sludge while the storm raged outside. 2,000 feet above, the world was ending, but Silas Vance was making tea. The entrance to his cave was buried under 10 feet of drift, acting as a perfect, airtight insulator. The wind outside was a physical weight, a roaring beast clawing at the rock face, but inside the air was still. Silas checked the thermometer his father had left him. 55 degrees. He walked to the back of the cavern where the thermal spring bubbled, the steam rising in lazy spirals to condense on the ceiling and drip into his irrigation channels. He wasn't just surviving. He was thriving. He sat down, opened a book, and let the storm bury the world he used to know. He was ready. For 3 weeks, the storm raged with a violence that felt personal, as if the Almighty were trying to scrub the valley clean of human error. When the wind finally died in mid-November, it left behind a world sculptured in white iron. The snow was packed hard enough to walk on, and the silence was absolute. In the high country, silence usually meant peace. But in Salvation, the silence was the sound of death. The town was broken. Smoke rose from only half the chimneys, thin gray ribbons that looked like surrender flags. The first time men tried to dig their way into Sterling's storehouse, the fortress of commerce, they didn't cheer at the sight of the grain. They vomited. The smell hit them before the sight did, a cloying, sweet stench of fermentation and decay. The moisture and the latent heat had turned the bumper crop into a black, moldy ruin. The weevils, woken by the damp warmth, had finished what the rot started. Panic, sharp and jagged, set in. The illusion of civilization had been stripped away, leaving only the primal math of survival. Zero food meant zero future. "We have nothing," Mayor Abernathy whispered. He stood in the flickering light of the church, where the survivors had huddled for warmth. His face was gray and gaunt, the face of a man who had watched his authority freeze to death. "The livestock is dead. The grain is rot. We are going to die here." Montgomery Sterling sat in the front pew, wrapped in 3 heavy fur coats. Yet he was shivering uncontrollably. He looked small. The arrogance that had once filled the room had been freeze-dried out of him, leaving only a terrified old man. He stared at the floor, his empire of ledger books and banknotes now worthless against the cold. "The boy?" The voice was thin, scratching against the silence from the back of the room. It was Thomas Brennan, the builder's son. He was 18, broad-shouldered, but currently wasting away on a diet of boiled leather and hope. "The boy," Thomas repeated, louder this time, his voice gaining traction. "Silas. He went to the mountain." "He's dead," Sterling snapped. There was no heat in the shout, just the reflex of a man used to being right. He's been dead for 2 years. That mountain is a tomb. If we're dying in these houses, that mute brat is a frozen statue up there. What if he isn't? Thomas stood up, his legs shaking from malnutrition. He took the maps. He knew about the heat vents. I remember he tried to show us with his hands before you kicked him out. It's a fool's errand, someone muttered from the shadows. Suicide. Staying here is suicide, Thomas countered, his eyes hard. I'm going. I'd rather freeze trying to climb than rot sitting in this pew. 3 other young men stood up. They were skeletons in oversized clothes, their eyes hollowed out by hunger, but they burned with the desperate, reckless energy of the dying. They had no proper gear. They fashioned snowshoes from the floorboards of the ruined town hall and wrapped their feet in layers of burlap and rags. They took no food, for there was none to take. They walked out of the church and into the blinding white. The town watched them go, ghosts watching ghosts, as Thomas and his ragged crew began the slow, agonizing ascent into purgatory. They were chasing a memory, a rumor, a silent boy they had all forsaken. They were climbing toward a peak that Sterling had called useless, praying that the mute boy had found a way to speak back to the storm. The climb was a slow, agonizing ascent into purgatory. The snow on the north slope was blindingly bright under the winter sun, a white desert that stretched forever. The wind, though calmer than the storm, still carried a razor's edge that sliced through their layers of burlap and desperation. One man turned back after the first hour, his toes blackening inside his boots. The remaining 3, Thomas Brennan and the 2 Miller brothers, pressed on, fueled not by calories, but by a hallucination of hope. By the time they reached the tree line, they were crawling. Thomas's lungs burned as if he were inhaling glass. He looked up at the barren rock face, the useless land Sterling had mocked years ago. There was nothing there, just snow, rock, and the indifference of nature. He's gone, one of the Miller brothers wheezed, collapsing face first into the drift. There's nothing here. We're dead, Tom. We're just dead men walking. Thomas fell to his knees. Tears froze instantly on his cheeks. He lowered his head, ready to let the cold take him, ready to sleep the forever sleep. Then he smelled it. It wasn't sulfur, it wasn't pine, it was roasting meat. Thomas jerked his head up, the scent hitting his starving brain like a physical blow. He blinked, rubbing the ice from his eyelashes. There, 100 yards to the east, barely visible against the gray rock, was a disturbance in the air, a shimmer. A thin, steady ribbon of smoke was rising from a hole in the snow. It wasn't a wild geothermal vent. It was too rhythmic, too purposeful. Get up, Thomas croaked, grabbing the Miller brother by his collar. Look. They dragged themselves the last 100 yards, their bodies screaming in protest. As they got closer, they saw the snow around the hole had melted away, revealing dark, wet earth, a scar of life in a landscape of death. Thomas reached the opening. It was a tunnel, shored up with timber, descending into the mountain. A warm, humid breeze wafted up, carrying the scent of wood smoke, damp soil, and, miraculously, cooking food. Thomas leaned over the hole, his voice cracking as he shouted down into the dark. Silas! There was no answer, only the echo of his own desperation. But then a shadow moved in the tunnel. A figure emerged from the gloom, silhouetted by a soft, golden light from below. It was Silas. He wasn't a frozen corpse. He wasn't a starving skeleton. He was wearing a vest made of rabbit fur, his arms bare and muscular, glowing with health. He looked up at the three dying boys, his face calm, his eyes dark and unreadable. He didn't speak. He didn't smile. He simply stepped aside and gestured with one open hand. Come in. Stepping into Silas's sanctuary was like walking through a portal into another dimension. One moment, Thomas and the Miller brothers were shivering in a monochromatic hell of white wind and gray ice. The next, they were enveloped in a humid, fragrant embrace that defied every law of the winter outside. The tunnel opened into a cavern that wasn't a dark, dank hole. It was a cathedral of survival. Thomas blinked, his eyes stinging as they adjusted to the soft, pearlescent glow radiating from the mica sheets, angled perfectly along the walls. The light caught the steam rising from the geothermal troughs, turning the air into a shimmering mist. But it was the smell that brought him to his knees. It wasn't the metallic tang of snow or the sour stench of fear that had plagued the church. It was the rich, loamy scent of turned earth and the savory aroma of rabbit stew. Silas didn't rush to them. He moved with the deliberate, efficient grace of a man who wasted nothing, not even motion. He didn't offer pity, he offered bowls. He handed Thomas a vessel carved from birchwood, filled with a broth so rich it tasted like life itself. Floating in it were chunks of tender potato and bright green kale, colors Thomas hadn't seen in months. As the hot liquid hit his stomach, Thomas wept. He didn't cry from sadness. He cried from the sheer, overwhelming realization of their own stupidity. He did it, one of the Miller brothers rasped, staring at a wall of thriving mushrooms. The crazy bastard actually did it. Silas watched them, his face a mask of impassive calm. He didn't sign, "I told you so." He simply pointed to the empty bowls and ladled more. 2 days later, a ragged procession began the ascent from the valley floor. Thomas had returned to salvation not as a boy, but as a prophet. He had stormed into the freezing church, thrown a sack of fresh potatoes at the mayor's feet, and delivered a message that shattered the town's last illusions. The Fool of Shadow Mountain was the only king left standing. The Exodus was a humbling spectacle. The town of Salvation, once proud of its high-steepled church and Sterling's grand emporium, was now a caravan of refugees. Men wrapped in curtains and rugs pulled sleds piled high with their last possessions. Mothers carried babies swaddled in layers of wool, their faces hidden from the biting wind. At the back of the line, stumbling and wheezing, walked Montgomery Sterling. The richest man in the territory was a ruin. His fur coat was matted, his silk cravat stained with soot. He carried nothing, no gold, no deeds, no ledger. The cold had stripped him of his assets, leaving only a shivering, elderly man who had led his people to the brink of extinction. The climb took 6 grueling hours. When the first families reached the plateau outside Silas's cave, they stopped, stunned into silence. Silas had been expecting them. He stood at the entrance of his tunnel, flanked by Misty, his gray mare. The horse looked like a mythological beast, her coat thick and healthy, steam billowing from her nostrils like dragon smoke. Silas wore a tunic of cured hides, his arms crossed over his chest. He looked like part of the mountain itself, unyielding, ancient, and absolute. The townspeople formed a semicircle, shivering in the snow. No one spoke. The shame was a physical weight, heavier than the packs on their backs. They were the jury that had exiled him. Now they were the beggars at his gate. Mayor Abernathy tried to step forward to negotiate, but his legs gave out. It was Sterling who moved. He pushed through the crowd, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He stopped 10 feet from the boy he had branded a thief. The wind howled around them, but the space between the man and the boy felt dead silent. Sterling looked up. For the first time in his life, he had to crane his neck to look up at Silas Vance. Sterling's voice cracked. The boom was gone. I called you a vagrant. Silas didn't blink. He just watched, his dark eyes reflecting the white snow. I said you were a burden, Sterling continued, tears freezing in his beard. I built a storehouse of pine and pride, and it killed us. You built a home of dirt and silence, and it is the only life left. The old man's knees shook. Then, with a groan that seemed to come from the very bottom of his soul, Montgomery Sterling collapsed. He didn't fall. He knelt. He drove his knees into the hard-packed snow, bowing his head until his forehead touched the ground near Silas's boots. I have no money to offer you, Sterling whispered into the ice. I have no authority. I am a fool who thought he was a king. Please, teach us. Do not let them die because of my sin. A gasp rippled through the crowd. The sight of their tyrant, the man who owned the valley, prostrating himself before the mute outcast, broke something in the air. The tension snapped. Silas looked down at the shivering heap of fur and regret. He could have left him there. He could have turned his back and sealed the tunnel. It would have been justice. It would have been the American way, survival of the fittest, the triumph of the individual. But Silas Vance was building something new. He uncrossed his arms. He stepped forward, the snow crunching under his boots. He reached down, his rough, scarred hand gripping Sterling's trembling shoulder. With a strength that surprised them all, Silas hauled the old man to his feet. He didn't smile. He didn't sign forgiveness. He simply looked Sterling in the eye, held his gaze for a long, heavy second, and then turned. He raised both arms, encompassing the entire shivering town, and gestured toward the tunnel. The warmth from the entrance drifted out, kissing their frozen faces. Enter. It was the loudest thing he had ever said. When the great thaw of 1889 finally broke the winter's back, it didn't bring the usual jubilant noise of spring. It brought a quiet, reverent clarity. The survivors of the ghost storm emerged from the belly of Shadow Mountain not as refugees, but as disciples. They looked down at the valley floor and saw the cold, hard truth. The town of Salvation was a wreckage of splintered wood and shattered glass, a waterlogged monument to a failed philosophy. The civilized world, built on arrogance and hasty timber, had crumbled under the weight of nature's indifference. Meanwhile, the useless rock above, the place they had scorned, had cradled life. Under Silas's silent tutelage, the hierarchy of the town was permanently inverted. The social ladder didn't just break, it dissolved. The men who used to debate politics and stock prices in the saloon now learned the meticulous art of grafting roots. The women who had once turned their noses up at the mute brat learned how to harvest condensation from the cavern walls. Montgomery Sterling, stripped of his fortune but finally possessed of his soul, made the first move toward a new future. He didn't order the reconstruction of his store. He didn't try to reclaim his title as the town patriarch. Instead, he used his remaining credit to buy hydraulic piping, glass for greenhouses, and sacks of hardy seed. We do not go back down, Sterling announced, his voice raspy but resolute. Down there, we built for the world we wanted. Up here, Silas built for the world as it is. They didn't rebuild Salvation. They dismantled it. They hauled the salvageable timber up the mountain and began a new kind of American construction. Inspired by Silas's palace, they dug into the earth, building sod-roofed homes that hugged the hillsides and utilized the geothermal veins Silas had mapped. It wasn't a town of straight lines and white picket fences which sought to dominate the landscape. It was a rugged, organic settlement that moved with the land, not against it. When territorial surveyors arrived in 1890, expecting to find the old boom town, they found the valley floor empty. Confused, they rode up the trail to find a thriving community of 300 souls living in warm, earth-sheltered homes. When asked for the name of the town, Mayor Abernathy didn't look to a map. He pointed to the man standing quietly by the community well. "This is Vance's Peak," he said. "Silas Vance never became a mayor. He never held office, and he never sought the spotlight. He remained a solitary, enigmatic figure who spent his days tending to the massive apple orchard he planted on the southern face of the mountain." It was a poetic irony lost on no one. The boy exiled for stealing one rotting apple had grown a forest that fed them all. He lived to be 82 years old. In all that time, he never uttered a sound. He didn't need to. His voice was in the hiss of the steam vents that warmed the schoolhouse, in the crunch of the fresh apples in autumn, and in the laughter of the 3 orphans he adopted and raised as his own. When he died in 1955, they didn't bury him in a dark box. They laid him to rest beneath the largest apple tree in the orchard, facing the sunrise. Montgomery Sterling's grandson read the eulogy to a crowd that stretched as far as the eye could see. "Some men speak to be heard," he said, looking out over the thriving town that clung to the granite. Silas Vance lived so that we could hear the earth. The town of Vance's Peak still stands today. It remains a testament to the idea that even the most broken among us, the outcasts, the silent, the rejected, can hold the keys to our survival. It reminds us that sometimes the ones we cast out are the only ones who know the way home.